Hello, this is Kevin Cromash with CORP2020. I'm here today at Yale University with a true leader in the fields of sustainable business and sustainable economic development, Professor Stuart Hart. Professor Hart, it's great to be here with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You take a very interesting viewpoint in saying that business can have a role in solving some of the issues of poverty in the least developed countries. Can you briefly summarize some of the points of your thesis?
Sure. And it involves kind of turning your thinking over, maybe kind of like turning things on their head a little bit. It starts with the realization that you can become kind of bought into a particular mindset. And I'd say going through the 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s, the idea was, there's sort of a global division of labor. Businesses for rich people, and the poor, that's a global division of labor. That's for the NGOs and the government to worry about. Maybe the philanthropic sector too. But that poor people just by definition don't have money, therefore there's no business opportunity. End of story, right? So it's easy to compartmentalize things that way. And I think what we were able to do with this idea of business and the bottom or the base of the pyramid was to really kind of turn that upside down. And when you look at it through a business lens, you begin to see things a bit differently. First of all, you discover that under the surface, so there's the surface of water and there's the tip of the iceberg, which would be GDP per capita. So in the developing world, that might not be very high. But it turns out most economic activity is actually below the surface. It's in the informal economy. So there's an enormous amount of kind of bubbling away entrepreneurial micro-enterprise-based activity below the surface that never is recorded in any official statistics, that if you're able to figure out how to effectively tap into that, there's enormous possible opportunity. Typically, poor people get really bad service at a high price. So when you look at things in business terms, there's sort of a price umbrella being held over the top of the base of the pyramid by bad vendors more often than not. Pay a lot for credit, a lot for water, a lot for, that generally it's bad service at a high price. The poverty penalty, you can think of it as. So as a business person, you look at that and say, well, if we can just wrap our mind around a new concept, a new business model, then actually there's a huge opportunity here because there's this tremendously high price and poor quality service. We have an opportunity to come in and enter a space that's really not very contested at all.
It sounds like a lot of the ideas that you talk about have to do with what we call goal alignment at CORP2020. That is, corporations need to not just create demand for products that don't really improve people's lives, but actually have their own goals aligned with those that the societies in which they operate also hold. How do you see this concept of goal alignment playing into business enterprises into the future?
I think it's really a central concept to, again, one of the buzzwords, sustainable business or sustainable enterprise. I think core to this, in fact, probably the underpinning idea, the central tenet, is that you can optimize results for all the stakeholders simultaneously. That it's not a matter of just trading one off against the other, that to better serve the customer, you don't have to screw the supplier, right? It's not a zero-sum game. It takes some work and some imagination and some effort to figure out how to shatter trade-offs and deal with surface conflicts, but it is possible, right? We can see examples of it out there in the world where companies have figured out how to actually optimize results that serve everyone's interest. We could look at examples in the US, we could look at examples in the developing world. You look at a company in Brazil like Natura, as an example, which has developed a very interesting strategy which sources raw materials from the rainforest, does so in a sustainable way that supports local communities, and then works through a cadre, really an army of women across the country and now the world as not just distributors, but really as kind of business partners in many ways. So it's income generating, community building, but also tremendously commercially successful for the company at the same time. So I think we could point to not a lot of examples, but enough examples where companies have figured out how to create wins for all the stakeholders such that all of them do better. To me, the key here is you often hear triple bottom line, right? And one of the first things that comes to mind is that it's a zero-sum game. If you get more environmental value, that means it's less financial value, and there's some total amount of value. I don't think that's the case. You know, what it's really about is optimizing results for all of the stakeholders, and you can actually create more sustainable value that way, more total value.
It's fascinating, and you know, one of the goals that we should sort of have corporations seek out, one of the broader goals, is that of community. We actually did an interview with the CEO of Natura, Alessandro Carlucci.
Yep.
And we talked a lot with him about community. They view their 1.2 million housewives as their community. They call them consultants. They work with them. You know, you've written about how community ties will sometimes disintegrate when the money economy replaces the traditional economy. We view community building as one of the key components of the future corporation. Have you seen examples of corporations that really do a good job of building community among their customer base, among their employees, among other stakeholders?
I think we see some glimmers of that. Right? I mean, again, we're turning a big ship here. So most of the examples that we can point to, I would say, are still relatively small experiments. In other words, if you look at large existing companies, they're launching new experiments that have some of the characteristics that you're describing. They may not have been able to kind of implant, you know, these principles in all of their core businesses. So where we see it is in either startups that begin from a new frame, or in entrepreneurial experiments within companies. As an example, because I do a lot of work in India, there's a company that, of course, people there will know, and maybe others as well, called ITC, which, of course, began as a tobacco company, but has become much more diversified over the past decade or two, is in a wide range of businesses, including food and agriculture. And among other things, they've launched within the past few years an initiative in wasteland reforestation. And it's actually really a very interesting kind of sustainable business initiative. Because what it really does is take rural communities where, you know, agricultural practices have eroded the soil, so essentially you have wasteland. So it's difficult for people to even subsist. Water shortages, you know, the soil's washed away. So that contributes to migration, you know, out-migration to the city. And what the company's done is begin to invest in those communities to reforest the land. So there's training provided. Local people become kind of microforesters, plant, maintain, sustainably harvest. ITC also happens to be in the pulp and paper business. They've developed a biopulping technology which can be used on the spot. Right? In other words, you don't necessarily have to haul raw logs to a pulp mill. It's a distributed solution, which I think is increasingly going to be the way to go. So what you have are communities now that where there's investment, where soil's being rebuilt, right? Where you're literally building new soil through reforestation, but at the same time building livelihoods, generating livelihoods, which reduces the flow of migration and begins to solidify the community.
That's a hopeful example, and I know you have a lot of these, so it really is an exciting time. At the same time, we also see corporations that latch onto this consumer demand for better environmental and social performance, and have found it just to be cheaper to advertise when their real activities belie that. We call this accountable advertising. We need to put a stop to the greenwashing and move to a more accountable age. How do you see corporate advertising needing to change?
You know, I take the view that the greatest thing about capitalism is that there's no central director, right? That means that there's the ability for lots of different approaches to flourish. And then the worst thing about capitalism is that there's no central director, right? Which means that a lot of different approaches can flourish, at least for a time. I guess where I would come down on this is that ultimately, those companies that spend enormous amounts of money on advertising to create either false impressions or impressions that may or may not amount to much, that takes a lot of time, energy, and money, and it's a big push, right? In the end, that's not a very strong value proposition. Yeah. in the end, the companies that create embedded, important, highly valued value propositions that are pulled in by people in communities and that are spread by word of mouth, and where you form literally a love relationship with the company, that spreads virally. You reduce dramatically the need to spend money on advertising when you do that. It's a more competitive model. And in the end, those companies are going to win.
So if we were to see all these changes that we've talked about today, decentralization of technology, goal alignment, building community, more accountable advertising, what do you think the world would look like? What's your vision of the corporation of the future?
Well, I think, and that's why I think the theme is so on target, of Corporation 2020, because I share the sense of time frame, of urgency. And I think we're well into a transformation. It's been going on now for probably 20, 25 years. We're well into it. Sometimes when you're in the middle of a transformational period, it's not always as easy to see how much has already changed, but a lot has already changed. We still have obviously a long distance to go, and I think we're going to see truly transformational change over the next decade. These things typically do kind of mount like S-curves, right? And so I believe that we're in the midst of one of those periods where everything changes. And I think the companies that fail to see this, that fail to invest in the necessary innovations, kind of entrepreneurial experiments, quite frankly, just won't be around in 2020.
I do think we're on the cusp of a big change. So Professor Hart, it's been great talking to you.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.